Everyone wanted the horse of the mountain man. He traded it for the obese girl. The morning sun cast long shadows across Red Ridge, Texas, as the townsfolk gathered in the dusty square. It was September 1827, and the small settlement buzzed with an electric, almost feverish commotion. Word had spread that Caleb Stone, the legendary mountain man, would be coming to town with his most prized possession, the gray horse. That horse had become the stuff of frontier legend, whispered about in saloons from San Antonio to Fort Worth, debated in trading posts from Missouri to the Rio Grande. For 5 years, prospectors, settlers, and ambitious ranchers had obsessed over that magnificent creature. Some said Caleb had won it in a legendary poker game high in the Rocky Mountains, a game that had lasted 3 days and involved stakes that included land, gold, and possibly even a woman's virtue, though the details of that claim remained appropriately vague. Others claimed he'd found it wild and untamed in a hidden mountain valley, managing to break it through sheer force of will and countless hours of grueling patience. Still others swore they'd seen him perform impossible feats on the horse's back, leaping across chasms, outrunning thunderstorms, riding through snow that would have killed any ordinary animal. Whatever the truth, the gray horse represented far more than mere animal flesh and bone. It symbolized opportunity, wealth, and the kind of fortune that could transform a man's entire existence on the frontier. In a world where life was precarious and futures uncertain, the horse had become a kind of talisman, an object that absorbed every ambitious man's dreams. Men had offered Caleb fortunes for that horse, fortunes that would have seemed impossible to ordinary frontier settlers. A Philadelphia businessman had allegedly proposed $10,000, a sum that could have purchased entire ranches in Texas. A wealthy cattleman from Austin had suggested trading half his ranch and a partnership that would last for life. Even a banker from San Antonio had mentioned the possibility of an arrangement that would have made Caleb comfortable for decades, perhaps forever. Yet the mountain man had refused them all with a silence that was somehow more eloquent than any spoken rejection. This refusal had spawned endless speculation. Why keep the horse? What did it mean to him? Was it simply pride? Was there a deeper reason rooted in the mysterious years Caleb had spent alone in the wilderness? Some people whispered that the horse carried some kind of curse or blessing, that it possessed qualities beyond the merely physical. Others suggested that Caleb was simply mad, that prolonged isolation in the mountains had corrupted his mind in ways that made him incapable of rational decision-making. The morning Caleb rode into town, the entire population of Red Ridge seemed to gather, drawn by an impulse that felt almost supernatural. The streets emptied as people made their way to the square. Merchants left their shops unattended. Mothers abandoned their morning chores. Even the blacksmith, in the middle of shoeing a horse, set down his tools and walked toward the commotion. He was a man of perhaps 45 years, weathered by decades in the wilderness, until his face looked like it had been carved from leather and stone by a particularly unforgiving sculptor. His eyes were a peculiar gray-blue, the color of winter mornings in the high country, the color of ice-cold mountain streams. He wore buckskin, as he always did, clothes that seemed less like garments and more like a second skin, earned through years of harsh terrain and unforgiving elements. His expression was unreadable as he guided the gray horse toward the town square, his movements economical and assured. The horse itself was extraordinary in a way that defied ordinary language. Its coat, shimmered like polished silver in the morning light, catching and reflecting the sun in ways that seemed to defy the laws of nature. It moved with a grace that seemed almost unnatural for such a large animal, its hooves barely seeming to touch the ground. The creature's muscles rippled beneath its coat like waves on a luminous sea, and its mane flowed like water, like silk, like something not entirely of this world. Every person in that square held their breath, captivated by the sight, unable to look away. Marcus Holloway, the town's wealthiest merchant and most influential citizen, stepped forward with an eagerness that barely concealed desperation. He was a portly man with slicked-back hair, eyes that constantly calculated profit margins and power dynamics, and a reputation for getting what he wanted through any means necessary. "Mr. Stone?" Holloway called out, his voice carrying across the square with practiced authority. "I trust you finally decided to discuss a reasonable offer for that magnificent animal. I'm prepared to make an offer that will exceed anything you've received previously. Substantially exceeded." Caleb said nothing. He simply tied the horse to a post with movements that seemed ritualistic, almost ceremonial, and stood silently, watching the crowd with the patience of someone accustomed to wading through long mountain winters. That was when Elijah Cartwright arrived, and the mood in the square shifted, became darker, heavier. Cartwright was the town's creditor and debt collector, a man universally disliked but universally feared with a fear that bordered on primal. He held notes on half the families in Redridge, and he showed no mercy in his collections, enforcing his claims with a brutality that had driven at least 2 families to suicide and several others into permanent exile. He rode into the square with a whip coiled at his side like a serpent and a sneer on his face that suggested he found the entire human race contemptible. Behind him, walking in chains, actual iron chains, as if they were imprisoning a dangerous criminal rather than a young woman, came Lydia Ashford. The crowd murmured, and most looked away, unable to face what they were witnessing, unable to confront the visible evidence of their own town's cruelty. Lydia was perhaps 23 years old, though the circumstances of her life had aged her beyond her years, pressing her down like a physical weight. Her family had come to Texas with dreams of prosperity, dreams that had seemed reasonable and achievable in those early years. Her father had attempted to start a cattle operation, but he lacked the cunning and ruthlessness necessary for frontier business. Within a year, he'd fallen into debt to Cartwright through a combination of bad luck, poor judgment, and deliberate manipulation by Cartwright himself. Within 2 years, he'd abandoned his family entirely, fleeing westward in the dead of night, leaving behind a wife and 4 daughters without so much as a goodbye. The debts remained, however, and they grew with interest, compounded upon interest, multiplying like some kind of mathematical curse. Lydia's mother had worked herself to exhaustion trying to pay them down, taking in laundry and mending from the town's families, her hands becoming raw and cracked, her body growing increasingly frail. 2 of Lydia's younger sisters had been apprenticed out as servants to merchant families in a neighboring county, essentially indentured servitude that would last for years. But Lydia herself had become the last resort, the final desperate asset that could be liquidated to settle the family's crushing debt. She was a large woman, and in that time and place, her size represented not strength or health, but failure. In an era when thinness was the standard of beauty, when pale, delicate features were considered ideal, when women were supposed to be small and decorative and easily managed, Lydia's robust frame and ruddy complexion marked her as fundamentally undesirable, almost monstrous by the standards of frontier society. She had a strong body shaped by physical labor and hardship, and her face, while pleasant enough and marked by intelligent eyes, bore none of the decorative qualities that men supposedly sought. She was invisible in the worst possible way, visible enough to be judged, but judged so harshly that it amounted to invisibility. Cartwright had paraded her around town for weeks, a grotesque exhibition designed to humiliate her family further and extract whatever value he could from their desperation. He'd tried to find someone willing to marry her or purchase her labor contracts for a sufficient sum to cover the family debt. No one had shown serious interest. A few crude jests had been made by the crueler members of the community, jokes that had left Lydia's mother weeping and Lydia herself hardened against further hurt. Even the jokes revealed how thoroughly Lydia had been dismissed by her community. She was simply the fat girl, the visible symbol of her family's failure, a walking reminder to others of how quickly fortune could turn to ruin. When Cartwright arrived in the square with Lydia in chains, many assumed it was simply another failed attempt to sell her off, another public humiliation before she was consigned to whatever final fate awaited her, perhaps a workhouse in a distant town, perhaps something worse that no one dared speak aloud. What happened next would be remembered and retold in Red Ridge for generations, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. Caleb Stone walked directly to where Lydia stood, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He looked at her without anger, without pity, and without the peculiar mixture of contempt and discomfort that most people in town displayed around her. He simply looked, really looked, the way one might study a painting or a sunset, with genuine attention and without judgment. Lydia, bewildered and frightened, looked back. For the first time in her entire life, she felt truly seen. "How much is owed?" Caleb asked Cartwright, his voice rough from long seasons spent mostly in solitude, speaking to no one but himself and the mountains. Cartwright's eyes widened with the sudden realization of what was about to happen. Was it possible? Was the mountain man actually interested in the girl? The thought seemed almost absurd, yet here it was, manifesting in reality. $800, Cartwright said, unable to hide his shock and greed. "Plus my fee for managing this transaction, of course. Another 100, 900 total." The crowd waited, suspended in a moment of terrible anticipation. Caleb turned back to his horse. He took the reins in his weathered hands and began to walk it toward Cartwright. With each step, the implications of what he was about to do became clearer to everyone watching. "No," Cartwright said, almost laughing, as if his brain couldn't quite process what was happening. "You can't. You wouldn't." "I'll trade the horse for her," Caleb said simply, his words falling into the square like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread outward. "For her freedom and the cancellation of her family's debt. Complete cancellation." For a moment there was silence so profound it seemed as if time itself had stopped. Then the entire square erupted. People laughed harsh, mocking laughter that seemed to come from somewhere primitive and cruel within them. They pointed. They made crude jokes about Caleb's mental state, about the depths of his insanity or his moral degeneracy. They invented elaborate explanations for why the mountain man would make such a catastrophic error in judgment. Didn't he understand what he was surrendering? Didn't he comprehend that he was trading something genuinely valuable, something that represented real wealth and power, for something that held no value at all, for a girl that nobody wanted? The laughter continued, feeding on itself, growing louder and more vicious. Marcus Holloway stepped forward, his face red with a mixture of amazement, offense, and barely concealed greed. This was his opportunity to acquire the horse after all. "Stone, you're a fool," Holloway said, his voice cutting through the laughter. "That horse is worth 5 times what he's asking. More than that, far more. I'll give you $2,000, $3,000. Name your price, and I'll—" "The horse for the girl," Caleb repeated, his voice steady and absolutely final, looking directly at Cartwright and ignoring Holloway completely. Yes or no? Cartwright, who had grown up in an environment where profit was the only language that mattered, where every human interaction could be reduced to numerical values, smiled with undisguised greed and nodded. "Done," he said simply. He removed the chains from Lydia's wrists and ankles, the iron clinking as it fell away. Then he took possession of the gray horse, running his hands over its coat with barely concealed glee, already mentally calculating the wealth he would accumulate. Within hours, word spread throughout Red Ridge that Cartwright intended to sell the horse to Holloway for an astronomical sum money that would make him wealthier than he'd ever dreamed, money that would cement his power in the town. But Caleb didn't watch the transaction. Instead, he turned to Lydia and offered her his hand. His palm was calloused and weathered, a hand that had worked the earth and the mountains, a hand that had learned gentleness despite decades of harsh survival. "You need clothes, shelter, and time to figure out what happens next," he said, his words kind but matter-of-fact. "I have a cabin about half a day's ride north of here, in the foothills. My sister lives there with her family. She'll help you. She'll understand." Lydia stared at him, unable to speak. Her mind couldn't process what was happening. No one had shown her kindness in so long that the sensation was almost foreign, like touching something warm after years spent in the cold. "Why?" she finally managed to ask, her voice barely audible. "Why would you do this? You don't even know me." Caleb considered the question as seriously as if it had been the most important philosophical inquiry ever posed to him. The kind of question that demanded an honest answer, because everyone in this town looked at you and saw only what they didn't want, he said slowly. They saw a burden, a problem to be disposed of, a symbol of failure. I looked at you and saw a person with value, that's worth more than a horse. The cabin in the foothills was modest but comfortable, built with care in a location that commanded views of the valley below and the mountains beyond. Caleb's sister, Rebecca, was a woman of perhaps 50, with her brother's same gray-blue eyes and his same capacity for quiet wisdom. She welcomed Lydia without judgment or surprise, as if she'd been expecting her all along, as if Caleb's brother had sent some kind of message that she'd received and understood perfectly. Over the following weeks, Lydia experienced something she had never known before, genuine, unconditional acceptance. Rebecca treated her not as a charity case or an obligation, but as a person worthy of respect and care. Rebecca taught her skills, not the submissive, deferential skills that frontier society expected women to possess, but practical, valuable knowledge that came from decades of living independently. how to manage a household with efficiency and grace, how to preserve food for winter using techniques that ensured nothing went to waste, how to heal common ailments with herbs and plants gathered from the mountain slopes, how to ride a horse competently and with confidence, how to shoot a rifle accurately if necessary for protection or hunting, how to read weather patterns and predict storms days in advance. More importantly, Rebecca taught Lydia something more fundamental: how to exist in the world without shame, how to accept herself despite the judgments of others, how to recognize her own worth not through the eyes of Red Ridge society, but through the reflection in her own conscience. Caleb was often away, hunting or conducting the various business of maintaining his property and his extensive trading connections throughout the frontier. He was a man with contacts throughout the Western territories, people who trusted him implicitly. But when he was present at the cabin, he treated Lydia with a consistency and respect that gradually dissolved the shame that had calcified within her during her years in Red Ridge, the shame that had accumulated like deposits of stone around her heart. One afternoon, several months after she'd arrived at the cabin, as snow was beginning to fall in the high country and the world seemed to be transforming into something pristine and new, Lydia was helping Rebecca prepare a meal when she asked a question that had been growing in her mind, demanding to be articulated. "Why did Caleb really do it?" Lydia asked, her hands working bread dough as she spoke. "Why did he trade the horse? Rebecca, I need to understand. I need to know if he expected something in return, if I owe him something." Rebecca smiled and continued chopping vegetables with practiced efficiency. "My brother spent 20 years in the mountains before he came back to civilization," Rebecca said, her voice carrying the weight of genuine knowledge. "He left when he was 25, and he didn't return until he was 45. Those years taught him things that most people never understand, things that can only be learned through solitude and suffering and genuine confrontation with nature's indifference." She paused, looking out the window toward the foothills, where snow was transforming the landscape into something almost unrecognizable. "He learned that value isn't something that exists in a thing itself," Rebecca continued. "Value is something we create collectively through our attention and belief. The horse was only valuable because people had decided it was valuable. Its actual worth, its real significance, was entirely dependent on human judgment and desire." She turned back to Lydia, her eyes serious and penetrating. "But my brother also learned something else during those 20 years, she said. "He learned that people are worth far more than any animal, no matter how magnificent. He learned that the greatest worth often goes entirely unrecognized by society. He learned to see with a different kind of vision, one that penetrates surface judgments." Rebecca set down her knife and stepped closer to Lydia. "When he saw you in that square, he understood something that no one else in Red Ridge could grasp. He understood that the town's blindness was their failing, not yours. He saw your strength, your dignity, your fundamental worth as a human being, and he understood that the horse, magnificent as it was, represented the old world, the world of possession and accumulation and endless striving for more. You represented something new, the possibility of genuine connection and real meaning." That evening, when Caleb returned from hunting in the higher elevations, his clothes dusted with new snow, Lydia found him tending to the corral, caring for the horses with the same meticulous attention he gave to everything. She approached him carefully, though by now her initial caution had softened considerably into something closer to trust. "Rebecca told me something today," Lydia said, her breath visible in the cold mountain air. "About why you did what you did." Caleb turned to face her, and in the golden light of approaching dusk, she could see his face clearly, the lines etched by hardship and solitude and decades of exposure to harsh elements, but also something gentler underneath, something that spoke of wisdom rather than mere experience. "She told you the truth, then?" he said simply. "Yes," Lydia replied, stepping closer. "But I want to know if there's something more, something she didn't say, something more personal." Caleb set down the tools he'd been using and faced her fully, his gray-blue eyes meeting hers with a directness that made her heart quicken. "When I looked at you in that square," he said slowly, each word chosen with obvious care, "I saw someone with strength still intact, despite everything that had been done to diminish her. I saw someone beautiful in a way that has nothing to do with the fashionable ideals of a town that doesn't deserve to judge you. I saw someone who might understand, if given the chance, that there's more to life than the cruel measurement society imposes on us." He took a step closer, and she could see the intensity of emotion in his eyes, carefully controlled, but definitely present. "I traded the horse because I was gambling on something more important than any animal," he continued. "I was gambling on you, on us, on the possibility that two people, both wounded by circumstances beyond their control, might build something real together." He reached out and took her hand, and the touch was gentle, tentative, asking permission. "I've spent 52 years on this earth," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "The first 30 were wasted in solitude, looking for something I didn't understand. I thought I was looking for freedom, or purity, or escape from the corruption of civilization. But what I was really looking for was connection, meaning. Someone who understood that there's more to a person than what other people can see." He squeezed her hand gently. "You weren't a consolation prize or the unexpected benefit of my choice," he said. "You were always the treasure. That horse was just the medium through which I could express my understanding of what truly matters in this world." By the spring of 1828, a full year after that fateful morning in Red Ridge's Square, Caleb had built a new house, not the simple cabin he'd occupied before, but a real structure with multiple rooms, solid wooden floors, and windows that could be opened to let in the mountain air. He'd constructed it with his own hands over the winter months, and Rebecca had helped him plan the interior, choosing locations for the kitchen and the bedrooms with the practicality of someone who understood how families lived and what made homes functional and comfortable. When it was finished, when the last board had been nailed and the final window installed, Caleb showed it to Lydia and asked her a question that changed everything, that set the entire trajectory of both their futures on a different course. "Would you stay?" he asked, his voice formal, as if he were conducting business rather than making the most important proposition of his life. "Not as my sister's companion, not as someone I've rescued and am honor-bound to help, but as my wife, as my partner in building a life together." Lydia had expected many things, but not this. She'd imagined gratitude, perhaps friendship, perhaps employment as a housekeeper or caretaker. But marriage? The thought seemed impossible, too good to be true, like a dream that might evaporate in the morning light. "You don't know me," she said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. Over the months, she and Caleb had spent countless hours together. They'd talked about everything, his years in the mountains and what he'd learned there, her family's struggles and her own dreams, the nature of human society, and what made certain lives matter more than others, the meaning of home and what it took to create one. He had come to know her more thoroughly than anyone had ever known her, not just her surface characteristics, but her thinking, her values, her secret hopes, and desperate fears. "I know you better than I've known anyone in my entire life," Caleb replied with absolute certainty. "And you know me. The question isn't whether I know you. The question is whether you want to build a life together, whether you're willing to risk it." Lydia said yes. She married Caleb Stone in the spring of 1828 in a simple ceremony witnessed by Rebecca, her family, and a handful of neighbors from nearby homesteads. The Red Ridge townspeople weren't invited, though word spread quickly enough through the frontier grapevine, reaching back to that settlement with accounts that ranged from romantic to utterly dismissive. The marriage was, from the beginning, a partnership of remarkable equality and mutual respect. Lydia brought organizational skills and practical intelligence to the running of the homestead. She managed the household with efficiency, planned the preserved foods with foresight, and handled the complex logistics of frontier life with a capability that seemed to grow more assured with each passing season. Caleb brought knowledge of the land that came from decades of living in it, extensive trading connections throughout the frontier, and a kind of philosophical wisdom that guided their decisions and helped them navigate the inevitable conflicts and difficulties that arose. By the autumn of 1828, Lydia discovered she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with a joy so profound and overwhelming that it occasionally brought tears to her eyes, tears of a completely different character than any she'd shed before. This wasn't the weeping of desperation or shame or fear. This was the overflow of genuine happiness, the physical manifestation of a heart that had learned to hope again. She gave birth to a son in the spring of 1829, a healthy boy with his father's gray-blue eyes and the determination that seemed to run through the Stone family. They named him James. 2 years later came a daughter, Catherine, with her mother's auburn hair and her father's quiet, observant temperament. The children seemed to carry within them the best qualities of both parents, the strength and resilience from Lydia, the wisdom and patience from Caleb. The homestead thrived and prospered in ways that seemed almost miraculous to those who knew about Caleb's initial trade. Caleb's trading connections brought goods and valuable information from across the frontier. Lydia's management transformed the property into something more prosperous than most frontier operations, more stable and well organized. They kept cattle and horses, grew crops in the fertile ground near the creek that ran through their property, and gradually built a life of genuine comfort and security. But it wasn't easy. The frontier remained dangerous and unpredictable. There were winters that nearly killed them all, droughts that threatened everything they'd built, sickness that swept through their family with terrifying speed. Through all of it, Caleb and Lydia remained committed to each other and to the vision they'd created together. Red Ridge itself experienced the Great Drought of 1831-1833, a catastrophe that transformed the settlement from a place of modest prosperity into a symbol of frontier fragility. The wells ran dry, despite desperate digging. The cattle died by the hundreds, their bodies decomposing in the heat. Many families were forced to abandon their properties and migrate westward, driven by desperation and the realization that some places simply couldn't sustain human life. Marcus Holloway, having invested everything in land speculation and the expectation of endless growth, lost nearly everything. His grand plans for developing Red Ridge into a major trading hub evaporated like water in the drought. Elijah Cartwright, having made enemies through his relentless and cruel debt collection, found himself without protection or allies when times grew hard. He eventually left Texas, heading to Louisiana where, rumor had it, he found work as an overseer on a sugar plantation, a fitting destination for a man who'd lived by extracting maximum value from human suffering. But Caleb and Lydia's homestead survived, and more than survived, it prospered even during those desperate years. The creek that ran through their property, fed by underground springs, never fully dried despite the surrounding devastation. Caleb's foresight in storing water and his wife's careful management of resources meant they had enough. Lydia's preserved foods and stores meant they could feed not only their own growing family, but also neighbors who came to them in desperation, seeking assistance that no one else could provide. By 1835, their second son, William, was born during the tail end of the drought, a healthy child born into a world that was slowly recovering. By 1838, their third daughter, Margaret, arrived, completing the family in a way that seemed aesthetically balanced and deeply satisfying to both parents. The stone homestead became known throughout the frontier as a place of genuine prosperity and unusual harmony. Travelers spoke of the mountain man who'd traded away his most prized possession, the gray horse that everyone had wanted for a wife that nobody wanted, and how that improbable, seemingly foolish trade had resulted in a life of remarkable stability and happiness. Some told the story as a joke, mocking Caleb's initial decision, but increasingly the story was told with a kind of reverence, as if it contained a truth that people intuitively recognized, even if they couldn't quite articulate it. In 1840, as Lydia was expecting their fourth son, Caleb fell ill during a trading trip to the high mountains, to the territory where he'd spent those mysterious years of his youth. He returned to the homestead fevered and weak, suffering from some ailment he'd contracted in the high country, perhaps pneumonia, perhaps something else entirely, something that modern medicine wouldn't recognize or be able to treat. For 3 weeks, he hovered between life and death, suspended in a state between worlds. Lydia attended to him with a dedication that bordered on obsessive. She barely slept, sitting by his bedside through countless nights, monitoring his fever, coaxing him to drink water and eat broth, using every remedy that Rebecca could suggest or that frontier wisdom had taught her. During his fever, he spoke deliriously about that morning he'd seen her in chains in Red Ridge's square. He mentioned over and over that he'd known in that moment that everything else had been leading to that decision. All his years alone in the mountains, all his solitude and wandering, all the loneliness that had seemed unbearable at the time, had been preparing him to recognize value where others saw only worthlessness. He'd needed to spend 20 years learning to see clearly, learning to penetrate surface judgments, so that when he encountered her, he would know her worth immediately and absolutely. "You were always going to be my wife," he murmured during one fever dream, his hand gripping hers. "I just had to find you. I had to offer the thing everyone valued most to prove that I understood what real value actually was. Caleb recovered, though he never fully regained the vigor he'd known in his earlier years. The illness had taken something from him, leaving him a bit slower, a bit more prone to tiredness, as if it had burned away some essential reserve of vitality. But it also seemed to have clarified his mind and intensified his sense of purpose. He spent more time with his children, teaching them not just the practical skills of frontier survival, but also a philosophy of life that emphasized the recognition of value in unexpected places, the understanding that society's judgments are often profoundly wrong. Their fifth child, a son named Daniel, was born in the spring of 1841. With 5 children and a homestead that occupied much of their time and energy, Caleb and Lydia might have seemed overwhelmed, exhausted, unable to maintain their partnership. Instead, they seemed to have found a kind of balance that produced both prosperity and contentment, as if they'd discovered the secret to living fully in a world that often demanded compromise and despair. The children grew up with a different understanding of value than the one that had characterized Redridge and most of frontier society. James, the eldest, grew into a man who conducted his business dealings with fairness and integrity, having learned from his father's example that true success came from recognizing the worth in others. Catherine developed a reputation throughout the frontier as someone of genuine wisdom and insight, despite her youth, a woman who could see through pretense and social convention to perceive what actually mattered. William showed entrepreneurial skill combined with a generosity of spirit that impressed everyone who encountered him. Margaret became known as a healer, someone who understood both the practical and emotional dimensions of helping others. Daniel, the youngest, grew into a scholar and philosopher of sorts, the kind of man who asked difficult questions and thought deeply about human nature and society. By 1845, 17 years after that fateful morning in Redridge's Square, Caleb and Lydia stood together on a hill overlooking their property. The late afternoon sun cast everything in golden light. Their children were all thriving, each having found their own path while remaining connected to the homestead and to each other. The homestead had become not just a success, but a small dynasty, a place from which influence, prosperity, and good character radiated outward into the frontier. "Do you ever regret it?" Lydia asked, though she already knew the answer. Still, she wanted to hear him say it again, wanted to feel the affirmation of his commitment and his clarity. Caleb put his arm around her, a gesture of affection so natural and habitual by now that neither of them thought about it consciously. It was as if their bodies had learned to fit together perfectly, as if they'd been designed to stand exactly this way. "Not for a single moment," he said, his voice firm and absolute. "Not for 1 second of a single moment. That horse was a beautiful thing, magnificent in its way, but it was still just an animal. I would have eventually sold it or lost it or watched it age and grow feeble and finally die. I might have gotten wealth from it, but that wealth would have been empty, meaningless." He turned to face her fully, and she could see that his eyes, though aged by time and illness and decades of exposure to harsh elements, still held that same clarity of vision they'd had that day in the square. "Every year of peace and stability we've built together," he continued, "every child we've created, every decision we've made as partners, every moment of genuine happiness, it all flows from that one choice. I would make that same choice 1,000 times over. I would trade 1,000 horses for you." He took her other hand in his. "I've spent 52 years on this earth," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The first 30 were wasted in solitude, looking for something I didn't understand. The next 17, since I met you, since I chose you, have been the only ones that truly mattered. You were never the consolation prize or the unexpected benefit. You were always the treasure, the thing worth more than anything else in the entire world." Lydia, now in her early 40s, smiled. She'd come to Caleb's life as someone the entire world had deemed worthless, a burden, a shameful failure. Through him, through their partnership, and through her own strength and resilience, she'd become the architect of genuine happiness and prosperity. The transformation had taken years. It had required her to unlearn the shame that society had tried to brand into her very soul, to believe in her own worth in a way that seemed revolutionary and dangerous in the context of her time and place. But standing on that hill with her husband and seeing their children going about their business in the homestead below, she understood something profoundly important. The real trade Caleb had made wasn't a horse for a girl. It was a comfortable, solitary life, a life of safety and isolation, and the kind of peace that comes from not risking anything important for something infinitely richer. It was a life of genuine partnership and love, a life filled with purpose and meaning, a life that mattered. Years later, long after both Caleb and Lydia had passed from the world, their children would tell the story of the gray horse to their own children and to their grandchildren. The story would be retold at family gatherings, around campfires, in frontier settlements from Texas to California. It would become legend, then myth, a kind of moral tale that carried within it a truth deeper than any mere narrative could contain. Because the real value, the value that couldn't be quantified in dollars or horses or land, was the recognition of worth in someone the world had deemed worthless. It was the understanding that society's judgments are often profoundly, dangerously wrong. And the life that grew from that recognition, the partnership that emerged from that single act of clear-eyed perception, became something infinitely more precious than any treasure the frontier could offer. Caleb Stone's name lived on in those mountains, not as the man who'd once possessed a legendary horse, but as the man who'd understood what actually mattered. And Lydia's name lived alongside his, no longer whispered with shame, but spoken with respect and admiration, a woman who transformed herself and transformed the world around her through the power of partnership and love.